I'm gratified to report that 66,000 of you, our Kit Guru audience, witnessed my unboxing of this AMD Ryzen 5 5600X 3D processor that came all the way from the USA. As you can see, the processor is installed in this Gigabyte B550 Aorus Master. I've run plenty of benchmarks on it, so let me tell you what I found. The processor I'm reviewing today, this AMD Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, is a bit of an oddball, and this is the processor in this Gigabyte B550 motherboard with some DDR4 memory. And the really strange thing is that AMD launched this Zen 3 processor in the latter part of 2023, when we are solidly into Zen 4 territory. To give you an idea of the timeline, and I'm going to commit the briefest of history lessons, the original Zen was back in 2017, Zen 2 moved to TSMC 7nm and a chiplet approach in 2019, and then we came to Zen 3, which is Ryzen 5000 on the desktop. These processors reviewed very late in 2020. 18 months after the Zen 3 Ryzen 7, AMD brought us this, the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. That brings us up to April 2022. The difference between these two CPUs is that the 3D version has a great big slab of L3 cache on top of the dies, hence the name. This really helps gaming performance, but it actually hurts thermals and slows the processor slightly in general tasks. In gaming, however, this 3D processor was an absolute champ. AMD launched Zen 4 on the desktop, manifested as Ryzen 7000 in September of 2022, and a mere 6 months after the launch of Zen 4, we saw Zen 4 3D, and you'll note this is a Ryzen 9, a full 16-core processor with a huge amount of extra L3 cache. So we had to wonder, what on earth is AMD doing, launching the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D as a special processor only available from Micro Center in the USA. The only way we could find out was to get Wendell of Level 1 Tech to visit his local Micro Center on our behalf and to send us a processor so we could do some benchmarking and drill into exactly what's going on with this somewhat bizarre processor. Depending on your point of view, the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D is a Ryzen 5 5600X with extra cache, or it's a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D with fewer cores. Looking first at the Ryzen 5 5600X, it has 6 cores and 12 threads, base clock of 3.7 GHz, and a maximum boost of 4.6 GHz. TDP is 65 watts, and you will notice it comes with a Wraith Stealth cooler. By contrast, the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D has 8 cores and 16 threads, a base clock of 3.4 GHz, maximum boost 4.5 GHz, and that enormous 96 megabytes of cache. The TDP of the Ryzen 7 3D, 105 watts. It does not come with a cooler. And then we have the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, so 6 cores, 12 threads, base clock 3.3 GHz, max boost 4.4 GHz, again 96 megabytes of L3 cache, 105 watts of TDP, and it does not come with a cooler. All these processors use Zen 3 technology, socket AM4, and are compatible with DDR4 memory. When we look at the list of AMD Ryzen 5000 and 7000 processors, we can see Ryzen 5 5600X 3D comes quite a way towards the bottom of the listing. Naturally, you may be wondering, is the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D compatible with your AM4 motherboard? And the answer is almost certainly yes. The AGISA code that supports Ryzen 7 5800X 3D version 1.2.0.6b also supports the Ryzen 5. Clearly it was thought the Ryzen 5 3D might have launched at the same time as the Ryzen 7, and for whatever reason that never happened. So every AM4 motherboard we can think of has actually supported this Ryzen 5 5600X 3D for many months. We just didn't know this. For example, if we look at the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Master we've been using for our testing, we can see here the AGISA was updated a while ago, so Ryzen 5 support has been here for a while. We can also see there have been further updates which give enhanced support for Ryzen 5. it's possible your motherboard might support this processor without supporting it particularly well. Frankly, the only way to be sure is to try it. If we look at some older motherboards, here the Gigabyte X470 Aorus Ultra Gaming, this also has the correct AGESA support for this Ryzen 5 3D. Looking even further back and to other brands, the MSI B350 Tomahawk also supports this processor, and somewhat to our surprise, this Asus Prime A320 MK also has correct BIOS support and AGESA code for the Ryzen 5 3D. When you consider the power requirements for the Ryzen 5 are nothing particularly special, you can be confident that any motherboard that supports AM4 with this AGESA code will also have suitable VRMs to support this processor. In my testing of this Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, I'm mainly interested in comparing it to this regular Ryzen 5 5600X. Not that I think for 1 second anyone who has this regular processor is going to drop in the 3D in its place. You could, but that would be a small upgrade, although you're going to gain some decent frames in gaming, as you'll see when I get to the charts. You might, for all I know, be coming from something like this Ryzen 5 1500X, a processor that now seems prehistoric. But of course your entire platform might be quite old. So we're in the realms of what kind of upgrade are you performing. The way I see it is, if you're interested potentially in this Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, you are avoiding jumping to a whole new platform. So Intel LGA 1700, Core i5-13600K, for example, or AMD Ryzen 5 7600X. In both cases, you'll need a new motherboard, you'll need DDR5 memory. So you're thinking, can I boost my CPU and give myself a better gaming experience or video editing experience or some such? That's what my charts will be tackling. My test platform for the AM4 processors is this Gigabyte B550 Aorus Master, along with some Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 3600 memory. I also tested that Ryzen 5 7600X on this Gigabyte Aorus X670 Aorus Elite AX motherboard, along with some G.Skill Trident Z5 RGB memory rated at 6000 mega transfers. Moving on to the rest of the test system, the power supply is this brand new Seasonic Prime Platinum 1600 watt ATX 3.0, supports PCI Express Gen 5. The SSD I'm using this PNY Accelerate. I've removed the heatsink so it can fit under the Gigabyte heatsink on the motherboard. Like that. The graphics card is this Gigabyte GeForce RTX 4080 Gaming OC. Clearly this is completely over the top for a Ryzen 5. The point here is that when we're benchmarking CPUs, we want to remove any bottlenecks to performance. I am well aware of Jeff from Craft Computing's view on these things, which is that you should change the hardware depending on the setup. After all, you're not likely to match an RTX 4080 with a Ryzen 5 processor. True enough. However, if I benchmark some of the processors with the RTX 4080 and others with an RTX 4060 or an RTX 3060, how are you going to be able to see what the processor is doing? It does not mean you will necessarily get the same frame rates as me, unless of course you're using the same hardware as me. Thermal compound going on the CPU, Arctic MX6. And the CPU cooler going on our processors is this Corsair H150i Elite LCD. So it's a 360mm AIO. And yes, once again, overkill for a Ryzen 5, but entirely appropriate when we're using a Ryzen 9 or a Core i7 or a Core i9. I'm sure the point is clear. I'm not suggesting for one moment that you need a 360mm AIO on a Ryzen 5. After all, I don't want to run foul of Jeff. The point is, if I was to change from say a 240 AIO on this setup to a 280 on a Ryzen 7 to a 360 on a Ryzen 9 or a Core i9, you'd find it very difficult to follow the test charts and to compare one processor's cooling with another. We're trying to reduce the variables. We want to keep everything consistent and just vary the processor. Taking a look inside the BIOS, we see the settings for the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D look entirely conventional. The base speed is shown as 3.3 GHz, and when we switch over to the Ryzen 5 5600X, everything looks pretty much the same, except the base speed is 3.7 GHz. Sticking with the Ryzen 5 5600X, in a test run of Cinebench R23 multi-core, all the cores are running at 4.3 GHz, and the package power is 78 watts. Running Cinebench R23 on the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, the cores are slightly slower at 4.2 GHz, however the power draw has increased for the package to 95 watts. The corresponding figures in Cinebench R23 single core for the 5600X 4.64 GHz at 48 watts, while the 5600X 3D runs at 4.34 GHz at the same 48 watts. And so we come to our test charts. In Cinebench R23 multi-core, the two Ryzen 5s are down the bottom of the chart, with the regular Ryzen 5 5600X slightly ahead of the 3D. Power consumption in Cinebench R23 multi-core, the Ryzen 5 5600X draws 78 watts, and the 5600X 3D draws 98 watts. My feeling is the clock speed of the two processors, 4.3 GHz and 4.2 GHz, is so similar that we are seeing here the effects of that extra 3D cache. The CPU temperature in Cinebench R23 with that huge Corsair 360mm cooler, as you'd expect, these processors are running very cool. The regular Ryzen 5 5600X at 56 Celsius, this with an ambient of 21 degrees. The 5600X 3D, 73 degrees. The extra power is certainly having an impact on temperature, but clearly both processors are very cool. And we can see the other models of AMD Ryzen 7 are in the mid-70s. Interesting to note, the Zen 4 Ryzen, so the Ryzen 5 7600X drawing 99 watts at 85 degrees, the Ryzen 7 7700X drawing 145 watts up at 89 degrees. Zen 4 processors head towards their thermal limit and run pretty much as fast as they possibly can. Cinebench R23 single core. Down at the bottom of the chart we have the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, and then we have the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D with a very similar score. Above that we have the regular Ryzen 5 5600X. These figures are exactly what we expect to see. 7-zip benchmark. At the bottom of the chart, the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D. A fraction above that, the regular Ryzen 5 5600X. No surprises here. Aida 64 memory bandwidth. Clearly the type of memory is pretty much all that matters here. So the bottom four contenders all run on DDR4 3600. Then above that we have three AMDs running on DDR5 6000. At the top of the chart, Intel running on DDR5 6000. 3D Mark CPU profile. At the bottom of the chart, once again, the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, and just above that, the regular Ryzen 5 5600X. And then we move on to gaming. Borderlands 3 on the Badass preset at 1440p. We can see the regular Ryzen 5 5600X at the bottom of the chart. The average is impressive, 137 FPS, and the 1% low also pretty good at 80 FPS. But just look at the change with the extra 3D cache in that Ryzen 5 5600X 3D. The average jumps to 158 FPS, the 1% low to 88. Interesting to note if we look further up the chart at the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, so we're running at the same clock speed, but we have those two extra cores, and those do yield some benefit, 165 FPS. We can see it's the 3D cache that makes the big difference, and the 8 cores of the Ryzen 7 don't really bring much extra to the party. Right at the top of the chart we have the Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7800X 3D running fast with 8 cores and DDR5. You can see there's an improvement there too, but clearly it's all about the 3D cache. Moving on to Borderlands 3 at 1080p, the 3D processors rule the top of the chart. So it's the Zen 4 Ryzen 7 at the very top, 211 FPS, then the Zen 3 Ryzen 7, 186 FPS, and the Zen 3 Ryzen 5 3D at 172 FPS. Right down the bottom of the chart, the regular Ryzen 5 5600X, 138. For our second game, we're looking at Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. very high image quality preset, and 1440p. Again, at the bottom of the chart, the Ryzen 5 5600X 147 FPS, and then a huge jump to the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D at 193 FPS. Again, you gain a few extra FPS if you step up to the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, but there's not a lot in it. The Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is up the top of the chart by a clear margin. And Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy at 1080p, again, it's the 3D processors at the top of the chart, again in the order we expect. So the Zen 4 Ryzen 7 at the top with 236, then the Zen 3 Ryzen 7 at 200 FPS, and in third place, the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D at 193. Way down the bottom of the chart, the regular Ryzen 5 5600X at 148 FPS. Next we have Far Cry 6 Ultra preset at 1440p. As expected, at the bottom of the chart we have the Ryzen 5 5600X, average 125 FPS, and then a jump of 30 FPS to the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D at 155 FPS. 1% low is 99. This time the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D brings an extra 10 FPS to the show, so the 3D cache has far more effect than those two extra cores. Far Cry 6 at 1080p mixes things up slightly. At the top of the chart, as expected, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D with an average of 197 FPS. Behind that, the Zen 3 Ryzen 7 3D with an average of 164 FPS. In third place, we have the Zen 4 Ryzen 5 7600X, average 158, and 1 FPS behind that we have the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D. Then the Intel Core i5-13600K. Following that, a conventional Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7700X. At the bottom of the chart by a distant margin, the Ryzen 5 5600X. The next game is Hitman 3 on Ultra preset at 1440p. At the bottom of the chart, Ryzen 5 5600X at 129 FPS, and then we step up to 167 FPS with the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D. It's a similar story in Hitman 3 at 1080p. At the bottom by a very large margin, the Ryzen 5 5600X at 129 FPS, and then we have the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D at 170 FPS. It's a small step up from there to the Zen 4 Ryzen 5 and then the Zen 4 Ryzen 7. Another step up to the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. Intel's Core i5-13600K makes a good showing, and at the top of the chart in its accustomed position, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D with a huge score of 226 FPS. Our fifth game is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, clearly quite an old game now, but it still gives us good results. Running on the highest preset at 1440p. At the bottom of the chart, the Ryzen 5 5600X gets a very respectable score of 190 FPS. Next up we have the Core i5-13600K, and then the two Zen 4 processors, Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7, essentially tying. Although the average of the Ryzen 5 is 1 FPS higher than the Ryzen 7, you can see the 1% low is significantly better for the Ryzen 7 than the Ryzen 5. Above that, with a huge 271 FPS on average, we have the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D. In second place, the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, and topping the chart, once again, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, it's the 3D processors at the top, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, followed by the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, followed by the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, and yes, down at the bottom, it's the Ryzen 5 5600X. Our final game is Watch Dogs Legion on the Ultra preset, starting at 1440p. At the bottom, the Ryzen 5 5600X at 113 FPS, and then the Core i5 at 123 FPS. Then we have the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D at 134, and the other processors are relatively close together. Top of the chart, Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Our final result is Watch Dogs Legion at 1080p. Down the bottom, the Ryzen 5 5600X, 32 FPS above that at 144 on average. We have the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, and at the top we have the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, in second place the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. Before I get to my conclusions, I'm just going to offer some points about those charts. The Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, it draws significantly more power than the basic Ryzen 5 5600X and is operating at pretty much the same clock speed. I cannot decide whether it's inferior silicon to the basic Ryzen 5 or whether it's essentially a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D that has 2 cores disabled for whatever reason. It feels to me like it is a Ryzen 7, it's just only got 6 cores operating. There's something slightly odd going on there. When we compared the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D to the existing Zen 3 Ryzen 7, you could see it was running slower and using a lot less power. This Ryzen 5 is not behaving in the same way, or it's not being configured in the same way. Something slightly curious going on there. However, those charts, they fall into 2 distinct halves. Regular computing duties, Ryzen 5 nothing particularly special. In gaming, the extra cache makes that 3D processor rock along, and it scores almost as highly as the Ryzen 7 3D, just a small margin between the two of them. So, on to the verdict. As we come to the end of this review, I am of course going to offer you buying advice on this new Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, except I kind of can't. It's crystal clear that it's positioned between the regular 5600X and the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. Prices in the UK for the 5600X, £155, where the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D is £300. If you do a conversion of the dollar price of the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, you come up with £235. That all makes perfect sense. It's quite a stiff premium to pay for some 3D cache, but as you've seen, there's decent benefits in gaming. However, the total price to Kit Guru for this processor was £309. Wendell, bless his cotton socks, merely passed on the cost of the processor from Micro Center plus the UPS shipping to us, and then on top of that we got hit for taxes at import time. So the total price was actually slightly higher than simply going to the shops and buying a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. Therefore, my buying advice for you is walk away from this processor unless you happen to be quite near a Micro Center, or you can get your hands on one at the Micro Center price, in which case you might want to consider it. Other than that, it's just not an option. As for the pros and cons, this is where things get slightly vexed. The pros, the good points, the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D offers excellent gaming performance, as you've seen. And it's an easy upgrade for AM4 PCs if you fancy a boost in gaming, particularly obviously if you have an older AM4 platform. You're not already on Ryzen 5000, you're on 3000, 2000 or even 1000. And the third pro is you have a low overall cost to your upgrade, as you can reuse your motherboard and your DDR4 memory. Alternatively, if you're visiting Micro Center, we understand they often offer bundles of memory, motherboard and processor. We've seen a few of these offers online and they look very tempting. So clearly you could be building yourself a brand new Zen 3 gaming PC for quite a low outlay. Cons, the negative points. Availability is solely in store at Micro Center in the USA, which clearly is a bit of a problem for many of us. The 3D cache technology restricts clock speed. As we've seen, the 3D processors run slower than the non-3D versions, and also you're restricted when it comes to overclocking and taking liberties with the speeds. And finally, you don't get a CPU cooler with the package. With a Ryzen 7, that's not so much of a problem. You might want to use, quote, a proper cooler. With a Ryzen 5, a reasonable box cooler should actually manage to handle the thermals. Nope, you're buying a cooler. My final view on this Ryzen 5 5600X 3D is that the timing of the launch is very strange. It's old technology that's coming out 2/3 of the way through 2023. You have to suspect AMD held it back to avoid it competing with other processors in the lineup, and I imagine that they decided now's the time to clear the shelves and get rid of this processor. It's interesting to see once again the effect of the 3D cache, which has a massive impact in gaming, but the Ryzen 5 that's beneath the 3D cache, it's nothing special, and overall I regard it as a curiosity and nothing more than that.